My name is Margaret, and I'm 71 years old. At my younger sister Catherine's wedding 3 weeks ago, my parents made cruel jokes about my pretentious English accent in front of 200 guests, claiming I was putting on airs above my station. What they didn't know was that the distinguished gentleman sitting quietly at table 12 was someone who would change everything with just a few words. This is the story of how decades of family shame were transformed into unexpected vindication, and how sometimes the most powerful defense comes from the most unlikely source. Before I share this story with you, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel. I share real stories about family dynamics, about finding your voice when others try to diminish you, and about how life can surprise you when you least expect it. If these stories resonate with you, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe our experiences matter. My name is Margaret Davies, and I'm 71 years old. I'm sitting here in my garden cottage in Devon, England, looking out at the roses I've tended for the past 40 years. This cottage, with its stone walls and climbing ivy, represents everything I work to achieve: independence, beauty, intellectual fulfillment, and a peace I thought I'd never find after decades of feeling displaced between two worlds. 3 weeks ago, at my sister Catherine's wedding, all of those old insecurities came flooding back in the most humiliating way possible. But that same evening, something extraordinary happened that changed not just how my family sees me, but how I see myself and my entire life journey. Let me start from the very beginning, because understanding what happened at that wedding requires understanding the long, complicated path that led me there. I was born in 1953 in Rhondda Valley, Wales, in a tiny terraced house on Coronation Street, a name that seemed grand but described a narrow row of identical homes where coal mining families lived, worked, and dreamed small dreams. My father, Di Davies, worked the Mardy Colliery, coming home each evening covered in coal dust that seemed to seep into everything: his clothes, his skin, our furniture, even our hopes for something different. My mother, Bronwyn, was a fierce woman who stretched every penny until it screamed, who could make a Sunday roast last for 3 days' worth of meals, and who believed that respectability was more important than comfort. She kept our little house spotless despite the coal dust that constantly drifted through the valley, and she made sure that her daughters were always clean, properly dressed, and mindful of what the neighbors might think. My sister Catherine was born 2 years after me, and from her first breath, she seemed to understand something about the world that I never grasped. She was content. Content to play with the neighbor children in the street. Content to help Mum with the washing. Content to assume that her future would look very much like her present. She was a beautiful child. Blonde curls, bright blue eyes, an easy smile that made adults want to protect her. I, on the other hand, was restless from the beginning. While Catherine played house with her dolls, I was reading everything I could get my hands on. Books borrowed from the library, newspapers that neighbors had thrown away, even the labels on tins in the kitchen if nothing else was available. I asked endless questions that made the adults uncomfortable. Why did we live in such small houses when there was so much empty land in Wales? Why did Dad come home so tired and dirty every day? Why did the mine owners live in big houses on the hill while the miners lived in rows of tiny terraces? Too many questions, Margaret, Mum would say, but not unkindly. Some things just are what they are, but I couldn't accept that some things just were. I wanted to understand, to explore, to imagine possibilities beyond the narrow streets of our valley. School became my refuge. In the classroom, my endless curiosity was an asset rather than an annoyance. My teachers, especially Miss Evans, who taught English literature, recognized something in me that my family didn't quite know how to nurture. Margaret has a gift for language, Miss Evans told my parents during a conference when I was 12. She should consider continuing her education beyond what most children in the valley do. I remember the uncomfortable silence that followed. Dad shifted in his chair, his clean Sunday clothes making him seem smaller somehow than he did in his work gear. Mum twisted her handbag strap between her fingers. "Education is all well and good," Dad finally said, "but a girl needs to be practical. There's no shame in honest work." "Of course not," Miss Evans agreed carefully. "But Margaret has the potential for different kinds of work. Professional work, teaching perhaps, or writing. Professional work." In our house, that phrase carried the weight of impossibility. Professional work was for people from different families, different worlds, not for the daughters of coal miners. But Miss Evans persisted, and gradually my parents began to consider the possibility that their eldest daughter might have a different kind of future. It was scary for them. Education meant change, and change meant that I might grow beyond their ability to understand or guide me. By the time I was 14, my academic success had become a source of both pride and anxiety in our household. Pride because I was bringing home certificates and praise from teachers. Anxiety because each achievement seemed to carry me further from the world my parents understood. The changes weren't just academic. As I spent more time with teachers and books, as I was exposed to different ways of speaking and thinking, my own speech patterns began to evolve. I started pronouncing words more carefully, using vocabulary I'd encountered in literature classes, speaking in the measured cadences I heard from my teachers rather than the rapid musical Welsh of my family and neighbors. At first, these changes were subtle, but by the time I was 16, they were noticeable enough to attract comment. "Listen to our Margaret," Dad would say when I'd correct my sister's grammar or use a word he didn't recognize. "Sounds like she's practicing to be the queen, doesn't she?" It was said with a smile, but there was an edge underneath, a suggestion that I was getting above myself, that I was showing off, that I was somehow betraying my roots by speaking differently than I had as a child. "She's just learning, Di," Mum would say, defending me, but also warning me, as long as she remembers where she comes from. The implication was clear. Education was acceptable as long as it didn't change who I fundamentally was. But education, by its very nature, is transformative. Every book I read, every idea I encountered, every conversation I had with teachers and other students was changing me in ways both subtle and profound. When I earned a scholarship to Cardiff University to study English literature, it was the most extraordinary day of my young life. I remember running home from school with the letter, my heart pounding with excitement and terror. This was my ticket out, not out of Wales, which I loved, but out of the limitations that had defined my family for generations. My parents' reaction was complicated. They were proud. How could they not be? Their daughter was the first person in either of their families to attend university, but they were also frightened. University meant 3 years away from home, 3 years of influences they couldn't monitor or control, 3 years of becoming someone they might not recognize. "Just remember," Mum said as she helped me pack for my first term, "no matter how educated you get, no matter how far you go, you're still Di and Bronwyn Davies' daughter from Coronation Street." I promised I would remember, and I meant it, but I was 18 years old and about to enter a world I'd only imagined. How could I possibly know how much that world would change me? Cardiff University in 1971 was a revelation. I was surrounded by young people from all over Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, and beyond. Some came from backgrounds similar to mine, but many came from middle-class families where university education was expected rather than extraordinary. Some spoke with accents I'd only heard on television, refined, confident, carrying the authority of generations of education and privilege. In lectures, tutorials, and casual conversations, I was exposed to ways of thinking and speaking that were entirely new to me. My professors expected a level of articulation and sophistication that went far beyond what had been required of me in secondary school. My fellow students discussed ideas with a fluency and confidence that came from growing up in households where intellectual conversation was the norm. I realized quickly that my strong Welsh accent, while not something to be ashamed of, marked me immediately as working class in ways that could limit how seriously I was taken in academic discussions. It wasn't fair, but it was reality. If I wanted to succeed in this environment, if I wanted to be taken seriously as a scholar, I needed to develop what linguists call code switching, the ability to adjust my speech patterns to match different social and professional contexts. I began working with a speech therapist offered by the university's student services. She was careful to emphasize that the goal wasn't to eliminate my Welsh identity or heritage, but to give me additional tools for communication. Think of it as becoming bilingual, she explained during our first session. You're not losing your original language. You're adding another one that will serve you in different situations. The process was difficult and sometimes emotionally painful. I spent hours practicing pronunciation exercises, learning to modify the musical rise and fall of Welsh speech into something more neutral. I studied the vocabulary and grammatical structures used in academic writing and formal discussion. I watched BBC programs to absorb the rhythms of received pronunciation. Gradually, I developed what I thought of as my university voice, still recognizably Welsh, but refined, careful, carrying the authority and precision that my studies required. When I spoke in seminars or presented papers, I could hear myself sounding like my professors rather than like the girl who'd grown up on Coronation Street. The transformation wasn't just vocal. Everything about me was changing, my posture, my confidence, my way of moving through the world. I was learning to navigate libraries and lecture halls, to engage in intellectual debates, to think critically about literature and ideas in ways that would have been impossible in my previous environment. During my first year, I went home every few weeks, eager to share what I was learning with my family. But I quickly discovered that these visits were becoming more and more uncomfortable. The changes in me were obvious, and my family didn't quite know how to respond to them. "Listen to her now," Dad would say when I'd slip into my university way of speaking during family conversations. 3 months at Cardiff, and she sounds like she's working for the BBC. Catherine, who was now 16 and working at the local Woolworths, would roll her eyes when I tried to tell her about my courses. "Very interesting, Margaret," she'd say in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Even Mum, who had always been my strongest supporter, seemed unsure how to relate to this new version of her daughter. "You're getting very sophisticated," she'd say, and the word carried both admiration and concern. I began to feel like I was living a double life. At university, I was Margaret the scholar, the promising student, the girl who might actually make something of herself in the academic world. At home, I was still expected to be the Margaret they'd always known, grateful for their support, but fundamentally unchanged by her experiences. The tension came to a head during my first Christmas break. We were having dinner with extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who'd stayed local and followed traditional paths. I was trying to tell them about my studies when my Uncle Tom interrupted. "Christ, Margaret, you sound like you've swallowed a dictionary. What's wrong with talking like a normal person?" The laughter that followed was meant to be good-natured, but it felt like a slap. Here I was, working harder than I'd ever worked in my life, trying to build a future that would make my family proud, and they were treating my efforts like pretension or showing off. "There's nothing wrong with how Margaret talks," Mum said, but her defense was half-hearted. "She's just learning new things. Learning to be too good for her family, more like," Uncle Tom continued. "Mark my words, she'll be back in a few years, pregnant and looking for a job at the shop, and all this fancy talking will be forgotten." I excused myself from the table and went to my childhood bedroom, where I cried angry tears of frustration. I wasn't trying to be better than my family. I was trying to be the best version of myself, using the opportunities they'd encouraged me to pursue. But it seemed impossible to make them understand that. The next 3 years followed a similar pattern. At university, I flourished. I earned top marks in my courses, developed close relationships with professors who became mentors, and began to envision a future for myself in academic life. I was elected to the student council, participated in the debating society, and even had some of my essays published in the university literary magazine. But each visit home became more strained. My family loved me, I knew that, but they increasingly seemed to view my success as a form of betrayal. My accent had evolved to the point where the difference between my university speech and my childhood dialect was impossible to ignore. My interests had expanded to include things, classical music, foreign literature, art history, that had no place in my family's world. Catherine, meanwhile, had left school at 16, as expected, and was dating a boy from the next street over. She seemed perfectly content with her choices, and my parents clearly preferred her path to mine. "At least Catherine hasn't gotten too big for her britches," I overheard Mum saying to a neighbor. "She knows who she is and where she belongs." The implication was obvious. I didn't know who I was, and I certainly didn't know where I belonged. By my final year at university, I was already thinking about graduate school, about a career in teaching and research. My professors were encouraging me to apply for advanced degrees, and I was beginning to see a path forward that would take me even further from the world of my childhood. But I was also increasingly isolated from my family. Phone calls home were stilted and brief. Holiday visits were exercises in code switching so extreme that I felt like I was performing a role rather than being myself. The graduation ceremony in 1974 was a perfect example of this growing divide. My parents came, dressed in their best clothes, proud but clearly out of their element among the academic robes and formal ceremonies. When my name was called, and I walked across the stage to receive my degree with first-class honors, they clapped enthusiastically. But at the reception afterward, when my professors and fellow students were discussing graduate programs and career opportunities, my parents stood awkwardly to the side, unable to follow conversations about academic life or contribute meaningfully to discussions about my future. "We're very proud of Margaret," Mum kept saying to anyone who would listen, but there was something defensive in her tone, as if she felt she needed to prove that they belonged in this world of educated people. Dad was even more uncomfortable, spending most of the reception looking at his watch and asking when we could leave. After graduation, I moved to London to begin a master's degree at King's College. The distance between me and my family became not just geographic, but cultural. London was everything the Rhondda Valley wasn't. Cosmopolitan, fast-paced, full of opportunities and ideas and people from all over the world. I lived in a tiny flat in Bloomsbury, worked part-time in a bookshop to supplement my graduate funding, and immersed myself completely in academic life. My research focused on Victorian women writers, particularly those who, like me, had risen from working-class backgrounds to find success in literary circles. The parallels weren't lost on me. George Eliot, born Marianne Evans, had transformed herself from a provincial girl into one of the most respected novelists of her time. Charlotte Brontë had moved from the isolation of Haworth Parsonage to the literary salons of London. These women had reinvented themselves without abandoning their essential identities, and they had faced criticism from their families and communities for their transformations. Studying their lives gave me perspective on my own situation. I began to understand that the tension I felt between my origins and my aspirations was not unique to me, but part of a larger pattern that occurred whenever someone attempted to transcend the circumstances of their birth. This understanding helped me develop more confidence in my choices and my evolving identity. When I completed my master's degree and was offered a position teaching at a prestigious girls' school in Kensington, I accepted without hesitation, despite knowing that it would create even more distance between me and my family. The Kensington School for Girls was everything I had dreamed of in an academic environment. Small classes of motivated students, a curriculum that emphasized critical thinking and literary analysis, colleagues who shared my passion for education and intellectual inquiry. The salary was excellent by the standards of the mid-1970s, allowing me to rent a proper flat and begin building the kind of life I had imagined for myself. But success came with costs. My accent had evolved to the point where it was barely recognizably Welsh. I had what linguistics call educated British, a neutral form of pronunciation that could have originated anywhere in the UK. My interests, my social circle, my entire way of life had diverged completely from anything my family could understand or relate to. Phone calls home became increasingly difficult. When I tried to share news about my work, my students, or my life in London, I could hear the silence on the other end of the line. My parents simply didn't have the context to understand what I was talking about. "That's nice, dear," Mum would say when I told her about a particularly successful class or a paper I'd presented at a conference. But I could tell she didn't really understand what any of it meant or why it mattered. Catherine, meanwhile, had married her childhood boyfriend and was starting a family. When I called to congratulate her on her first pregnancy, the conversation was warm but brief. "You'll be an aunt," she said happily. "Maybe now you'll have a reason to come home more often." But even as I promised to visit more frequently, I knew that the gap between my life and theirs was continuing to widen. How could I explain to my sister, who was content with domestic life in the valleys, that I was finding fulfillment in analyzing the narrative structures of 19th century novels? How could I share my excitement about academic conferences and research opportunities with parents who viewed my success with a mixture of pride and incomprehension? The visits home became less frequent, and when I did go, they were increasingly strained. Every conversation seemed to highlight the differences between who I had become and who my family thought I should be. "You've gotten very posh, haven't you?" Dad would say, when I'd unconsciously slip into formal speech patterns. "Hardly sound Welsh anymore." "I'm still Welsh," I would protest. "I'm just expanded." But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. Had I betrayed something essential about my identity in pursuit of education and professional success? Was there a way to honor my origins while also embracing the person I had become? These questions became even more complicated when I was offered a position at Oxford University in 1982. The opportunity was extraordinary. A lectureship in Victorian literature at one of the world's most prestigious universities. It would mean higher salary, smaller classes, more time for research, and association with the most brilliant minds in my field. But it would also mean moving even further from Wales, both geographically and culturally. Oxford represented the pinnacle of British academic establishment, ancient, traditional, elitist, in ways that would make my working-class origins even more obviously out of place. I spent weeks agonizing over the decision. When I finally called my parents to tell them about the opportunity, their reaction was predictably mixed. "Oxford," Dad said slowly. That's very fancy, isn't it?" "It's a good opportunity," I said carefully. "The kind of position most academics spend their entire careers hoping for." "Will you be happy there?" Mom asked, and I could hear the real question underneath. "Will you still be our daughter?" "I think so," I said honestly. "It's what I've been working toward all these years." There was a long pause. "Then you should do it," Dad said finally. "If it's what you want, you should do it." But I could hear the resignation in his voice. He was letting me go, not because he understood or approved of my choices, but because he recognized that I had moved beyond his ability to influence or guide. The move to Oxford marked the final stage of my transformation from Margaret Davies of Coronation Street to Dr. Margaret Davies of academic distinction. The university was everything I had imagined: intellectually stimulating, professionally rewarding, socially challenging in the best possible ways. My colleagues were brilliant, my students were motivated and engaged, and my research began to gain recognition in scholarly circles. I published articles in prestigious journals, presented papers at international conferences, and began work on a book about working-class women writers of the Victorian era. But success at Oxford also meant final acceptance that I would always live between worlds. In academic circles, despite my achievements, I was still occasionally perceived as an outsider, the girl from Wales who had worked her way up rather than being born to privilege. And in my family circle, I was increasingly seen as someone who had abandoned her origins in pursuit of a life they couldn't understand or appreciate. The annual visits home became exercises in careful navigation. I learned to modify my speech patterns, to avoid mentioning aspects of my life that would seem pretentious or irrelevant to my family, to perform a version of myself that was recognizable to them, even if it wasn't complete. Catherine's children provided some common ground. I could be the doting aunt, bringing interesting books and educational toys, sharing stories about London and Oxford that entertained without intimidating. But even these interactions were complicated by the fact that I was obviously the successful sister, the one who had made something of herself, while Catherine was just a wife and mother. The subtext was always there, unspoken but understood by everyone. I had chosen career over family, independence over tradition, intellectual fulfillment over domestic contentment. These weren't necessarily wrong choices, but they were different ones, and they had consequences for my relationships with the people I loved most. Years passed. I built a distinguished academic career, earning a full professorship, publishing books, mentoring graduate students, serving on editorial boards and academic committees. I traveled extensively during school holidays, exploring Europe and eventually other continents, experiences that enriched my teaching and my perspective on literature and culture. But I also remained fundamentally alone. I had relationships with men over the years, some quite serious, but they never led to marriage or children. The men I met in academic circles often seemed intimidated by my working-class background, while men from similar backgrounds to my own seemed threatened by my education and professional success. I became comfortable with independence, even proud of it. I had a beautiful flat in Oxford, filled with books and art and objects I had collected during my travels. I had work that engaged and challenged me, colleagues who respected my scholarship, students who benefited from my teaching. But I also had a family that increasingly felt like strangers, people I loved deeply, but could barely communicate with anymore. This dynamic persisted for decades. My parents aged, my sister raised her children, and I continued building my academic career. We maintained the forms of family relationship, birthday cards, Christmas visits, phone calls on holidays, but the emotional connection became more and more attenuated. The comments about my accent never stopped. If anything, they became more pronounced as the years passed, and the differences between my speech and theirs became more obvious. "Listen to her," Dad would say to visitors, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and mockery. "Sounds like the Queen herself, doesn't she? Our Margaret's gotten very refined." The word refined was always delivered with a slight edge, as if refinement were something to be suspicious of, rather than admired. Mum would sometimes imitate my pronunciation of certain words, exaggerating the differences for comic effect. "Pardon me," she would say in an affected voice when I'd used formal language. How terribly sophisticated. These moments always left me feeling defensive and hurt, but I learned to laugh along, to treat them as harmless family teasing, even when they felt like attacks on my authentic self. Catherine, to her credit, never joined in the mockery, but she never defended me either. She would smile uncomfortably when our parents made their comments, clearly grateful that she wasn't the target of their complicated feelings about education and social mobility. As my parents entered their 80s, I began visiting more frequently, aware that time was limited and wanting to repair some of the distance that had grown between us. But these visits were often emotionally exhausting. I felt like I was constantly performing, trying to be a version of myself that they could accept while also being true to who I had become. The tension came to a head 3 years ago during a particularly difficult Christmas visit. We were having dinner, and I was telling them about a conference I had attended in Italy, where I had presented research on Elizabeth Gaskell's industrial novels. It was fascinating to discuss her work with scholars from different countries, I was explaining. The international perspective really illuminated aspects of her social criticism that I hadn't fully appreciated before. There was a long silence at the table. International perspective, Dad repeated slowly. Social criticism. Do you hear yourself, Margaret? What do you mean? You can't just say you went to Italy and talked about books. You have to make it sound like you're solving the world's problems. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. I was describing my work, I said carefully. The same way you might describe something that happened at the mine. The mine? Dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, I spent 40 years underground digging coal. You spend your time sitting in comfortable rooms talking about books written by dead people. Don't pretend they're the same thing. I'm not pretending they're the same thing, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I'm just trying to share what's important to me. What's important to you, Mum said quietly, is apparently too complicated for us simple folk to understand. The accusation hung in the air between us. I was being accused of intellectual snobbery, of using my education to make my family feel inferior, of becoming someone who was too good for her raising. That's not fair, I said. I've never tried to make you feel inferior. I've just become someone different than who I was at 18. Different, Catherine said from across the table. Is that what you call it? The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. I realized that my sister, who had made traditional choices and seemed content with them, felt judged by my different path, as if my success implied that her choices were somehow lacking. Catherine, you never what? Never looked down on us? Never made us feel like we weren't smart enough or sophisticated enough for the great Dr. Davies? The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with hurt feelings all around, and a promise from me to visit more often, though we all knew that the fundamental issues hadn't been resolved. That was the last extended visit I made to Wales. We maintained contact, but it was stilted and formal, governed by politeness rather than genuine connection. So when Catherine called me 6 months ago to tell me she was getting married for the second time, I was surprised by the invitation and touched that she wanted me to be part of the celebration. Her first husband, Robert, had died 5 years earlier in an industrial accident, leaving her with 2 teenage children and a small pension that barely covered their expenses. Now she had found love again with Tom, a kind man who worked in construction and adored her children as well as Catherine herself. I know things have been difficult between us, Catherine said during our phone conversation. But you're my sister, and I want you there. Will you be my maid of honor? I was genuinely moved by the gesture and agreed immediately, hoping that this might be an opportunity to begin healing the rifts that had developed in our family over the decades. It won't be anything fancy, Catherine warned me. Just family and friends, maybe 60 people at the community center. Whatever makes you happy, I told her. I'm honored to be part of it. But as the wedding date approached, the guest list grew. Tom had a large extended family. Catherine's children wanted to invite their friends and teachers, and my parents had invited neighbors and old friends who wanted to celebrate with them. We're up to nearly 200 people now, Catherine told me during one of our planning calls. Tom's brother knows someone who can do the catering, and we've hired a proper DJ. It's turning into quite a celebration. I offered to contribute financially. My academic salary and careful saving over the years meant I could easily afford to help make Catherine's wedding special. But she politely declined. This is our wedding, she said firmly. Tom and I want to pay for it ourselves. I respected her independence, but I privately arranged for an expensive floral arrangement and a contribution to the bar service as my gift to them. The week before the wedding, I drove down from Oxford to Cardiff, where I had booked a room at a nice hotel. I had offered to stay with my parents, but their small house was already full with Catherine's children and other relatives who had come in for the celebration. The wedding was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in June at St. David's Church, followed by a reception at the Miners' Welfare Club. I arrived early on the morning of the wedding to help with last-minute preparations and to spend time with Catherine before the ceremony. She looked radiant. At 48, she had the kind of mature beauty that comes from having lived fully. Laugh lines around her eyes, silver threads in her brown hair, a confidence that hadn't been there when she was young. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, flattering her figure without trying to make her look younger than she was. "You look beautiful," I told her as I helped her with her veil. "Tom is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," she said, and I could see that she meant it. I never thought I'd find love again after Robert died. Tom makes me feel like a young woman again. The ceremony itself was lovely, personal, heartfelt, full of the kind of genuine emotion that makes even cynical observers believe in love. Catherine cried during her vows. Tom's voice cracked when he promised to love her children as his own, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church. I was proud to stand beside my sister as her maid of honor, and for those moments during the ceremony, it felt like we had recaptured something of the closeness we had shared as children. But it was at the reception that the old patterns reasserted themselves in ways I hadn't expected. The Miners' Welfare Club had been transformed for the occasion. White tablecloths covered the usual scarred wooden tables. Flowers decorated every surface, and fairy lights had been strung around the room to create a festive atmosphere. The DJ was playing a mixture of contemporary songs and older music that would appeal to guests of all ages. I had been seated at the head table with the immediate family, my parents, Catherine's children, Tom's parents, and siblings. The conversation was pleasant enough during dinner, focused on the ceremony, compliments for Catherine and Tom, and gentle teasing about married life. But as the evening progressed and alcohol loosened tongues, the atmosphere began to shift. It started innocuously enough. Someone at a nearby table mentioned a television program about Wales that had aired recently, and how the narrator's accent had been too posh to properly represent ordinary Welsh people. "That's the problem these days," said Mrs. Jenkins, one of my mother's oldest friends, her voice carrying clearly across several tables. "Everyone wants to sound English instead of being proud of their Welsh heritage." Several people nodded in agreement, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied discussions about accents and authenticity. "Exactly right," agreed Uncle Tom, my father's brother, who had driven down from Merthyr for the wedding. "Nothing wrong with a proper Welsh accent. It's people trying to be something they're not that gets my back up." I tried to stay out of the conversation, focusing on my meal and making small talk with Tom's parents, who seemed like genuinely nice people. But I could feel the discussion at the surrounding tables beginning to focus in my direction. "Like some people we know," I heard someone say, followed by laughter that seemed pointed rather than good-natured. My father, who had been drinking steadily since the ceremony, turned in his chair to address the room at large. "Oh, we've got our own example right here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across half the reception. "Our Margaret can barely say 2 words without sounding like she's reading the news on BBC." The conversation at nearby tables stopped, and I felt dozens of pairs of eyes turning toward me. Catherine shot me an apologetic look, but she was trapped in conversation with Tom's relatives and couldn't intervene. "Dad," I said quietly, "maybe we shouldn't—" "Shouldn't what?" he interrupted, his voice growing louder and more belligerent. "Shouldn't mention that my own daughter sounds like a stranger when she opens her mouth?" Mum joined in, her voice taking on the exaggerated posh accent she always used when mocking my speech patterns. "Oh yes, we mustn't mention such things," she said in affected tones. "That would be frightfully common of us, wouldn't it?" The laughter that followed was louder now and more cruel. I could see people at other tables turning to watch what was obviously becoming a family drama played out in public. "I don't understand what you want from me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but feeling my emotion beginning to rise. "You encouraged me to get an education. You supported me when I went to university. But now you act like the changes that education created are somehow a betrayal." "Changes?" Dad said, standing up now, swaying slightly from the alcohol. Is that what you call it? Margaret, you don't sound like you're from Wales anymore. You don't talk like our family. You don't even seem like the same person we raised. The room had gone largely quiet now, conversations stopping as people realized they were witnessing something more serious than playful family teasing. I am the same person, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. I'm still your daughter. I still love this family. I still remember where I come from. But I've also grown, and I've learned, and I've become more than I was when I was 18 years old. More than you were, Mum repeated, seizing on the phrase. Listen to that, everyone. She's become more than she was. I suppose that makes the rest of us less than we are. The unfairness of that interpretation stung deeply. That's not what I meant, and you know it, I said, standing up myself now. I meant that I've expanded my world, not that I've rejected my origins. Expanded your world, Uncle Tom called out from his table. Is that what they call putting on airs these days? More laughter, and I could see that this had become a kind of performance for the entertainment of the wedding guests. My humiliation was the evening's unexpected entertainment. You want to know what I think? Dad continued, encouraged by the audience's response. I think our Margaret is ashamed of us, ashamed of her family, ashamed of where she comes from, ashamed of how we talk and how we live. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After decades of trying to balance my love for my family with my need for personal growth, after years of careful code switching and diplomatic conversations, I was being accused of the one thing I had never felt, shame about my origins. That is absolutely not true, I said, my voice rising now despite my efforts to stay calm. I have never been ashamed of this family. I have never been ashamed of this family. I am proud of where I come from, proud of the values you taught me, proud of the work ethic and integrity that shaped who I am. What I'm ashamed of right now is being made to feel like I have to apologize for using the opportunities you encouraged me to pursue. The room was completely silent now, even the DJ having turned down the music to listen to what was clearly a family crisis playing out in public. You want me to talk like I did when I was 18? I continued, my Welsh accent actually becoming more pronounced as my emotions intensified. Fine, but don't pretend this is about family loyalty or Welsh pride. This is about you being uncomfortable that your daughter became something you don't understand, something that makes you feel, what? Inadequate? Left behind? I saw my father's face flush red at my words, and I knew I had crossed a line. But 40 years of accumulated hurt and frustration were pouring out of me now, and I couldn't seem to stop. For 30 years, every family gathering has included comments about my voice, my education, my life choices. 30 years of subtle and not so subtle suggestions that I've betrayed my upbringing by growing beyond it. Well, here's what I want you to understand. What I want to understand, Dad interrupted, his voice shaking with anger now, is when my daughter decided she was too good for her family. I never decided that, I shouted, losing the last of my composure. I decided I wanted to be more than the circumstances I was born into allowed. I decided I wanted to use my mind, to contribute something meaningful to the world, to build a life that mattered beyond these narrow valleys. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I had said exactly the wrong thing. Calling the valleys narrow in front of a room full of people who had chosen to build their lives here was like calling their entire existence small and meaningless. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see hurt and anger on faces throughout the room, not just my family, but neighbors, family friends, people who had known me since I was a child and had watched my transformation with a mixture of pride and resentment. Catherine stood up from her place at the head table, tears streaming down her face. "This is my wedding day," she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the room. "This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and now it's ruined." The weight of what I had done crashed down on me. In my hurt and anger, I had destroyed my sister's wedding, humiliated my parents in front of their community, and confirmed every suspicion anyone had ever harbored about educated people looking down on their origins. "Catherine, I'm so sorry," I began, but she held up her hand to stop me. Just stop, Margaret. Please, just stop talking." I looked around the room at faces filled with disappointment, anger, and hurt. Tom's family looked embarrassed and confused. The neighbors and family friends looked like they were witnessing something that confirmed their worst fears about what education could do to a person. My parents looked devastated. I was about to gather my purse and leave, to retreat to my hotel room and probably drive back to Oxford first thing in the morning, when a voice cut through the tense silence. "I beg your pardon, but I believe I have something relevant to contribute to this discussion." Everyone turned to look at the speaker, a distinguished gentleman who had risen from a table near the back of the room. He appeared to be in his early 70s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that immediately commanded attention. He was clearly not from the valleys. His accent was unmistakably upper-class English, his posture spoke of expensive education and social privilege, and his presence in this working-class Welsh celebration was so unexpected that it took a moment for anyone to process what was happening. "Who the hell are you?" my father demanded, still angry and now confused by this interruption from a stranger. The gentleman walked slowly toward our table, and the entire room watched in fascination as this figure of obvious authority and sophistication made his way through the crowd of wedding guests. "My name is Sir Robert Fitzgerald," he said, and I heard several people draw in sharp breaths at both the title and the crisp received pronunciation. "I apologize for intruding on what is clearly a private family matter, but I believe I have information that might provide some context for this discussion." Sir Robert stopped beside our table and looked directly at my parents. "You are Mr. and Mrs. Davies, I presume. Margaret's parents?" My father nodded, looking suddenly uncertain in the face of this man's obvious authority. "I wanted to introduce myself because your daughter saved my granddaughter's life, and I have been looking for an opportunity to thank her properly." The room was so quiet now that you could have heard a pin drop. Every eye was fixed on Sir Robert, and I found myself holding my breath, having no idea what he was about to say. 3 years ago," Sir Robert continued, his voice carrying easily across the room, "my granddaughter Charlotte was in her second year at Oxford, studying English literature. She was brilliant, had been since childhood, but she was also struggling with severe depression and anxiety that had gone undiagnosed for years." He paused, looking around the room to ensure everyone was listening. "Charlotte came from what most would consider a privileged background. Private schools, family wealth, every advantage that money and position could provide. But none of those advantages had taught her how to cope when her mental health began to deteriorate. I began to remember Charlotte, a quiet, intense girl who had been in several of my courses, always prepared, but often seeming fragile in ways that concerned me. Charlotte was failing her courses," Sir Robert continued, "not because she lacked intellectual ability, but because she was paralyzed by perfectionism and anxiety. She had stopped attending lectures, stopped submitting assignments, stopped eating regularly. Her mother, my daughter, was frantic with worry." He turned to look at me directly. "When Charlotte's college advisor recommended academic support, they suggested she work with Dr. Margaret Davies, not just because Dr. Davies was an excellent teacher, but because she had a reputation for being able to reach students who were struggling with more than just academic challenges." My heart was pounding now as I remembered those difficult months working with Charlotte, trying to help her not just with her coursework, but with the underlying issues that were making university life so difficult. "Dr. Davies spent countless hours with Charlotte," Sir Robert said, addressing my parents again. "Not just teaching her about literature, but helping her develop study strategies, coping mechanisms, and most importantly, helping her understand that academic success didn't require perfection. It required persistence and self-compassion." I remembered the afternoon sessions in my office, Charlotte crying over essays she was convinced were terrible, me trying to help her see that her standards were impossibly high and that her worth as a person wasn't tied to her grades. More than that, Sir Robert continued, Dr. Davies shared her own story with Charlotte. She told her about growing up in a working-class family, about feeling like she didn't belong at university, about the imposter syndrome that had plagued her throughout her academic career. I had told Charlotte about my background, hoping it would help her understand that everyone at university was struggling with self-doubt in some way, that feeling out of place was normal and survivable. Charlotte later told me that Dr. Davies was the first person at Oxford who had ever admitted to her that higher education could be emotionally difficult, that intellectual achievement often came at personal cost, that it was possible to succeed academically while still honoring your authentic self. Sir Robert's voice became more emotional as he continued. Charlotte credits Dr. Davies with saving her life, not just her academic career, her actual life. She had been contemplating suicide when Dr. Davies intervened, and it was Dr. Davies' combination of academic support and personal mentorship that helped her find her way through that dark period. I felt tears starting in my eyes as I remembered how worried I had been about Charlotte, how I had encouraged her to seek counseling, how relieved I had been when she finally began to improve. Charlotte graduated from Oxford with first-class honors, Sir Robert said, his voice filled with pride. She is now completing her doctorate in Victorian literature, with a particular focus on working-class women writers of the 19th century, a research interest directly inspired by Dr. Davies' courses and mentorship. He paused, letting that information sink in. But what impressed me most when I met Dr. Davies at Charlotte's graduation was not just her brilliance as a scholar or her effectiveness as a teacher. It was her authenticity and her deep connection to her origins. Sir Robert turned to address the entire room now. When I thanked Dr. Davies for her work with Charlotte, do you know what she said? She said, Charlotte reminded me of myself at her age, just a girl who needed someone to believe she belonged in places that seemed beyond her reach. I know what that feels like because I lived it. My mother was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks. Dr. Davies spoke about her childhood in Wales with such love and pride, Sir Robert continued. She talked about parents who had worked hard to give her opportunities they never had, about a community that had supported her education, even when they didn't fully understand where it would lead her. He looked directly at my parents. She told me that everything valuable about her teaching came from the values her family had instilled in her: compassion, hard work, integrity, the belief that every person deserves respect and support regardless of their background. The room was completely silent except for the sound of people crying quietly. I need you to understand something, Sir Robert said, his voice becoming more forceful. Your daughter has not abandoned her Welsh identity or her working-class origins. She has built upon them. She has taken the foundation you provided and used it to create a life of service that has touched hundreds of young people over the years. He gestured toward me. Doctor, Davies is known throughout Oxford not as someone who has rejected her background, but as someone who draws strength from it. Her colleagues respect her precisely because she brings a different perspective to academic life. The perspective of someone who understands what it means to struggle, to feel out of place, to work for everything you achieve. Sir Robert turned back to my parents. As for her accent, he said with a slight smile, I can assure you that in the circles where I have worked, diplomatic service, international business, academic conferences around the world, Dr. Davies is respected for her authenticity, not her pretension. She sounds like exactly what she is, an intelligent woman who has learned to communicate effectively in different contexts while never losing sight of who she is at her core. He paused, looking around the room one more time. I have worked with people from every social background imaginable, in every corner of the world. The most impressive individuals I have encountered are invariably those who, like Dr. Davies, have managed to honor their origins while refusing to be limited by them. Sir Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Charlotte asked me to give you this if I ever had the opportunity to meet you," he said, handing it to me. "She's written her doctoral dissertation on working-class women writers, inspired by your teaching. She wanted you to know that your work continues to influence her scholarship and her life." I took the envelope with trembling hands, too emotional to speak. "But more than that," Sir Robert said, addressing my parents one final time, "Charlotte wanted me to make sure your family understood what an extraordinary person you raised. Dr. Davies didn't become successful despite her background. She became successful because of it. The values you instilled in her, the love you gave her, the support you provided for her education, all of that is what made her capable of touching other lives the way she touched Charlotte's." He looked around the room, his gaze taking in all the wedding guests who had witnessed this extraordinary intervention. "In diplomatic circles, we have a saying, you can take the person out of their homeland, but you cannot take the homeland out of the person. Dr. Davies is living proof of that truth. She may speak differently than she did as a child. She may live in Oxford rather than Wales. But everything essential about who she is was formed right here, in this community, by this family." Sir Robert nodded politely to Catherine and Tom. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration," he said. "But I felt it was important that Dr. Davies' family understand how deeply she is respected and valued, not just for her academic achievements, but for the person she is, a person shaped by the love and values of this family and this community." With that, he returned to his table, leaving the room in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then my father sat down heavily in his chair, looking dazed. "A knight," he murmured. "A bloody knight came to our Catherine's wedding and told us our Margaret saved someone's life." Catherine was crying openly now, but they seemed to be tears of emotion rather than distress. "Maggie," she said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "I had no idea. I knew you were successful, but I didn't know you were helping people like that." Mum reached across the table and took my hand. "Margaret," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. We didn't understand. We thought you were trying to be better than us." "I was never trying to be better than you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I was trying to be the best version of myself that I could be, using the foundation you gave me." "The foundation we gave you," Dad repeated slowly, as if testing the truth of those words. Mrs. Jenkins, who had started the conversation about posh accents, came over to our table. "Margaret," she said, her voice humble, "I owe you an apology. I didn't understand what your education meant, what you were doing with it. I thought you were putting on airs, but you were putting them to use, weren't you?" Other people began approaching our table. Neighbors, family friends, Tom's relatives who had witnessed the entire exchange. Instead of the mockery and criticism I had expected, I was receiving apologies, congratulations, and expressions of pride. "We always knew you were special," said Mr. Williams from next door. "We just didn't understand how special, or what it meant for the rest of us." Tom's mother, a quiet woman who had seemed overwhelmed by the earlier drama, came to stand beside me. "What you did for that young woman," she said softly. "That's what really matters, isn't it? Not how you sound or where you live, but how you use your gifts to help others." The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. What had started as a public humiliation had become something like a celebration. The DJ began playing music again. Conversations resumed, but now they included me in ways they hadn't before. People wanted to hear about my work, about my students, about my life at Oxford. But instead of the suspicious or resentful questions I had grown accustomed to, these were genuine expressions of interest and pride. Catherine pulled me aside during a quiet moment. "I'm sorry, Maggie," she said. "I'm sorry for all the years I let them make those comments about your accent, about your life. I was jealous, I think. Jealous that you had adventures and achievements while I stayed home and raised kids." "Catherine," There's nothing wrong with the choices you made, I said firmly. You raised beautiful children. You built a loving home. You found happiness with Tom. Those are achievements too, important ones. I know that, she said. But I also know now that your achievements don't diminish mine, and mine don't diminish yours. We just chose different paths. Later in the evening, Sir Robert approached me as I was standing at the bar, still trying to process everything that had happened. I hope you don't mind my intervention, he said quietly. But I've seen too many talented people diminished by the very people who should be celebrating them. How did you know? I asked. How did you know what was happening, and why did you decide to speak up? He smiled. When someone starts making cruel comments about accents and education in a public setting, those of us who work in international relations tend to pay attention. It's a phenomenon we see frequently. Families struggling to understand members who have moved between social worlds. And Charlotte? Did she really say all those things about me? Every word was absolutely true, he confirmed. You changed her life, Dr. Davies. She's written extensively about the impact of your mentorship, not just on her academic development, but on her personal growth. He paused, looking around the room where wedding guests were now dancing and celebrating. Your family loves you deeply, he said. That was obvious from the beginning. They just needed help understanding that your growth wasn't a rejection of them, but a fulfillment of their hopes for you. But how did you end up here? I asked. At a wedding in a Welsh mining town? Sir Robert's smile became warmer. Tom, Catherine's husband, is my driver, he said. Has been for 3 years now. When he asked for time off to get married and mentioned that his bride's sister was Dr. Margaret Davies from Oxford, I asked if I might attend as his guest. I've been hoping for an opportunity to meet you in person, to thank you for what you did for Charlotte. I stared at him in amazement. Tom works for you. He's an excellent driver and a good man, Sir Robert said. When he told me about the family dynamics, about how difficult these gatherings were for you, I thought perhaps I could help provide some context that might be useful. You planned this intervention? I hoped for an opportunity to share Charlotte's story with your family, he admitted. I didn't expect it to be quite so dramatic, but sometimes these conversations need to happen publicly before they can happen privately. As the evening continued, I found myself in conversations I hadn't had with my family in decades. My parents asked detailed questions about my work, my research, my life at Oxford. They wanted to understand not just what I did, but why it mattered, how it connected to the values they had raised me with. So, when you're teaching these young people, Mum said, as we sat together toward the end of the evening, you're helping them the way that gentleman said you helped his granddaughter? That's part of it, I said. I teach literature, but I also try to help students understand that education is about more than just acquiring knowledge. It's about developing the tools to think critically, to express themselves clearly, to engage with ideas that can change their lives. Like what happened to you, Dad said, and there was wonder in his voice rather than resentment. Like what happened to me, I agreed. But Dad, none of it would have been possible without the foundation you and Mum gave me. The work ethic, the integrity, the compassion, those came from watching you, from seeing how you treated people, from learning what really matters in life. We were afraid we were losing you, Mum said quietly. Every time you came home, you seemed further away from us. You weren't losing me, I said. I was just learning to be myself in different contexts. The same way you might speak differently to the minister than you do to your neighbors, I learned to adjust my communication style for different situations. But you never forgot us, Dad said, and it wasn't really a question. I could never forget you, I said firmly. Everything good about who I am came from this family, from this community. I may live in Oxford, but my heart is still in Wales. As Catherine and Tom prepared to leave for their honeymoon, my sister pulled me aside one more time. Will you come home more often now? She asked. Will you bring more of yourself, instead of trying to be who you think we want you to be? I looked around the room at my parents, who were deep in conversation with other guests about their daughter, the professor. at the neighbors and family friends who had approached me throughout the evening to express pride and interest rather than suspicion. "Yes," I said, "I think I will." The drive back to Oxford the next morning was different from any journey home I had taken in 30 years. Instead of feeling emotionally drained and conflicted, I felt whole. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I had to choose between my family and my identity. My phone rang as I was crossing back into England, and I saw it was my mother calling. "Margaret," she said when I answered, "I've been awake all night thinking about everything that gentleman said yesterday." "Mum, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "Your father and we were wrong. We were so afraid of losing you to your education that we tried to make you feel guilty about succeeding. We thought if we teased you about your posh voice and your London ways, you'd remember you were just a girl from the valleys." I pulled over to the side of the road, needing to focus completely on this conversation. "But that gentleman was right," she continued. "You didn't forget where you came from. You used it. You took everything we taught you about working hard and caring about people, and you built something beautiful with it." She was crying, and so was I. "I'm so proud of you, Margaret. Not just of your success, but of who you are. You're still our girl from the valleys. You're just a girl from the valleys who became a doctor and a teacher and someone important enough that knights know your name." "I love you, Mum," I said through my tears. "And I love Dad. I never wanted to be anything other than your daughter. I just also wanted to be everything I could become." "You are," she said simply. "You're everything we hoped for and everything we were too frightened to dream you might achieve." That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with my family. Over the past 3 weeks since Catherine's wedding, I've spoken to my parents more than I had in the previous year. They ask about my work now with genuine interest rather than defensive suspicion. They want to understand my research, my students, my life at Oxford. Dad has started telling his friends at the pub about his daughter, the professor, and Mum has been reading articles I've written so she can better understand my scholarship. They still tease me occasionally about my accent, but it's different now. Affectionate rather than cutting, inclusive rather than alienating. Catherine calls me almost daily, sharing stories about her honeymoon, her new marriage, her children's plans for university. We're rebuilding the sister relationship we lost somewhere along the way, finding common ground between our different choices and different lives. Tom, it turns out, has been telling Sir Robert stories about his new family for months, including his concerns about the tension between me and my parents. Sir Robert's intervention wasn't entirely spontaneous. It was the thoughtful gesture of someone who understood family dynamics and wanted to help heal wounds that were hurting everyone involved. Charlotte has sent me several letters since the wedding, thanking me again for the support I provided during her difficult time at Oxford and sharing news about her doctoral research. She's planning to visit Wales as part of her dissertation research on working-class women writers, and my parents have invited her to stay with them, an invitation that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. And me? I'm learning to move between my two worlds with less anxiety, less sense of divided loyalty. When I speak to my students using my careful, educated diction, I'm using a tool I developed to serve them better. When I'm home in Wales and my accent becomes broader and more musical, I'm connecting to roots that ground and strengthen me rather than limit me. Both versions of my voice are authentic. Both versions of Margaret are real. Both are part of the same person who was shaped by working-class values and middle-class education, by Welsh community and international academic circles, by family love and professional achievement. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt caught between who you were and who you've become, please subscribe to this channel and share your own experiences in the comments. So many of us struggle with family dynamics around education, success, and social mobility. We need to tell these stories, to support each other through the complex navigation between honoring our origins and embracing our growth. Your story matters, and this community is here to listen and support each other. Sir Robert sent me a note the week after the wedding, along with a photograph of Charlotte at her doctoral defense. In his note, he wrote something that brought tears to my eyes. Your parents raised a remarkable woman. I hope they now understand what the rest of us have always seen, that your success is a reflection of their values, not a rejection of them. 3 weeks ago, I thought I would spend the rest of my life feeling like I had to choose between my family's acceptance and my authentic self. Thanks to an unexpected intervention from a stranger who understood what my parents couldn't see, I've learned that sometimes the most powerful defense of who you've become comes from someone who can explain your journey in terms your family can finally understand. My name is Margaret Davies. I'm 71 years old. I live in Oxford, but my heart remains in Wales, and I've learned that the voice we develop over a lifetime isn't just about accent or education. It's about having the courage to speak our truth while honoring the people who gave us the foundation to find that truth in the first place. Sometimes the people who love us most need help understanding that growing beyond their immediate world isn't the same as growing away from their love. And sometimes, just sometimes, that help comes from exactly the right person at exactly the right moment, in ways we could never have predicted or planned. The most beautiful part of this whole experience has been discovering that I don't have to choose between being my family's daughter and being my own woman. I can be both. I always was both. I just needed help believing it, and my family needed help seeing it. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves, and remember, you never know who's listening when you finally find the courage to speak up for who you really are. Sometimes that person has exactly the words needed to change everything.